Good evening, everyone, or whatever time of day it is you're watching this. I hope everyone is having a blessed and awesome week so far. I am finishing up schoolwork this week, so it's been a pretty busy first couple of days, but I am absolutely excited to study more about the parables with y'all this week. Last week, we explained what a parable was, how Jesus used them, and how we should study them. So what we're going to do this week is we're going to go ahead and dive into the parables. We're going to look at this parable using the principles we learned in the previous study. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to Matthew chapter 13, verse 1 through 9. Matthew 13, verse 1 through 9, and we're going to go ahead and begin looking at the parable of the sower, or the parable of the soils. Let's go ahead and read it. It reads, "That same day Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea, and great crowds gathered about him, so that he got into a boat and he sat down. And the whole crowd stood on the beach. And he told them many things in parables, saying, A sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured them. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they did not have much soil. And immediately they sprang up, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched. And since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and produced grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. He who has ears to hear, let him hear." Okay, let's go ahead and stop there in verse 9, and let's take a look at the background, because that's what we looked at last week, right? What we should dive into first. Before we dive into the explanation, let's get an understanding of what's going on here. Who is Jesus' audience? What is their ethnic makeup? Well, we see this great crowd made up of a largely Jewish audience, a largely Jewish consensus. So what all led to this moment of Jesus' teaching in chapter 13? Well, back in chapter 12, Jesus healed a man possessed of a demon who was both blind and mute, again, back in chapter 12, which aroused both interest as well as controversy, so much so that some accused Jesus of having performed that miracle by the power of Satan in chapter 12, verse 23 through 37. Now, the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 12, verse 38 to 45, they challenged Jesus to produce a sign, to which Jesus rebukes their unbelief, saying that they're representative of, as he describes, an evil generation. Also, Jesus' family, there in chapter 12, attempt to see him, but they couldn't because of the large crowd that kept them from being able to do that in Matthew chapter 12, verse 46 through 50. So then Jesus goes out to the seaside, and he speaks to this audience made up of many different people. Notice, he's in a boat during this. This is genius because he wants them all to be able to hear physically what he's saying as water, or rather as sound carries over water. Some scholars indicate, because of the way the grammar is structured in this passage, in the Greek, that Jesus might have been pointing at a farmer off in a field sowing, visible to his audience. So now, let's go ahead, now that we looked at the background, let's go ahead and look at the narrative. What is exactly saying here? Who's the first character in the parable? Well, you have a sower who goes out to sow. This would have been a familiar scene to his audience. See, fields in the first century, in first century Palestine, they were these long, narrow strips marked off and surrounded by footpaths. They didn't have fences or they didn't have hedges to block them off. The sower used this broadcasting method, taking one handful of seed at a time out of a seed bag, which was at his side, and he'd fling the seed over this wide swath. Now, the Art of Dispersal might have looked indiscriminate, like he was just throwing it anywhere, and to a large degree, it certainly was. But the method had this advantage of covering large areas of ground with evenly scattered seed. You see, a skilled sower would not waste seed by letting it fall and concentrate at patches or mound up little piles. He would throw the seed as widely and as evenly as possible. Now, you see, the goal was to cover the whole plow field with no margins on the perimeter left unseeded. Of course, it's impossible to throw seed by hand like that at the edge, especially when you're at the edge of the field, yet guarantee that it's going to stay within the boundaries. Some of this broadcast seed would inevitably fall outside the perimeter of the plowed field. Even the seed cast on the interior of the field, even that seed might find patches of ground where the soil wasn't fit for agriculture. Only the seed that found its way into good soil would ever yield produce worth harvesting. Everyone who had ever cultivated a crop fully understood this principle. Remember, this was a primary agricultural society. It wasn't a complex point to them. So now, who are the next characters he identifies? Well, the different soils. First, you have the wayside soil. This refers to those well-beaten footpaths that separated the fields. The soil there remained unplowed, of course, and in that arid climate, remember, they're in the desert. The pathways, when dry, were as hard as concrete. Now, as the sower threw seed on the outer edges of the plowed field, some of the seed would inevitably end up on that hard-baked earth of the wayside. Seed that landed there wasn't going to penetrate through, and because it wasn't going to penetrate through, it wasn't going to produce anything. It would just lie there. In the parable, what happened to the seeds that landed at the wayside? Remember, birds came and devoured them. Let me tell you, birds are surprisingly intelligent and relentlessly aggressive when it comes to snatching away scattered seed. Next, the soil that Jesus introduces to us is a soil with rock beneath its surface. This underlying rock would be invisible to farmers when they would first plow the field because the plowshare only penetrated about 8 to 10 inches deep. Now, on the surface, it appears to be healthy, fertile soil, but beneath its shallow layer is a limestone rock bed. So what happened with the seeds on this second soil? Remember, the scripture says that they sprang up. But what does that mean? See, the seed went in and it germinated, but as soon as it begins to look lush, it's going to wither away from lack of sufficient water and a deeply planted root system, as the roots can't get past a rock layer. For a while, the crop might look healthy and it might look full of potential, but then you got the sun, right? When the sun comes out, then the water is all dried up, it dies. On the surface, it looks pretty and it looks really leafy, but only because it can't grow abundantly beneath. Okay, so far we have the wayside soil, we have the soil with the rock beneath. What about the third soil? The soil that is thorn, remember the thorny, weed-infested soil. It's full of useless wild vegetation, thorns, nettles, thistles. The type of thorns that would have been there would have been the same ones used to make the crown of thorns that was placed on Jesus' head. So these thorns are roughly 1 inch or to 5 inches long. Now, this is in a time before weed killer and chemicals. So if you plowed up a field of weeds, what would happen? Well, they grow right back, especially from the mutilated remnants of the old roots. Freshly plowed, weed-infested soil is deceiving because it appears like it's good. But what happened to the seeds in the passage, in the parable? What happened to the seeds that were planted there? It says they were choked, right? These thorns and the weeds will suck up the soil's moisture, drain out the nutrients, block the sunlight from the crops, and thus choke out the life of everything beneficial growing in the field. So, okay, we've got wayside soil, rocky soil, thorny soil, and now we finally look at fertile, good soil. This is clean soil, free from weeds, with room for the crops to thrive. It's prepared soil. What happens when the seed lands there? Well, they produce grain, some 100-fold, right? The scripture says some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. In other words, for every denarius spent on seed, that sower earns 100 denarii in the sale of his crops. 10-fold would be a healthy return. So imagine 30, 60, 100. Okay, so now that we looked at the narrative itself, let's go ahead and look at some the subtle points to notice in the narrative. First, is anything said about the sower and his skill? Well, there's only one sower in the story. All we know is he does his job and he's doing it well. Second, is there anything said about the quality of the seeds? It all comes from the same source. The seed that survives and bears fruit is the same kind of seed that gets choked out by the weeds. There's no problem with the quality. See, the main emphasis of the story isn't the quality of the sower or the quality of the seed, because both of those are implied to be the best quality to do what they're supposed to do. But you see, the emphasis is the quality of the soil. Fourth, the way Jesus concludes is awesome when he says, "He who has ears to hear, let him do what? Let him hear." In Luke's account, it says, as he said these things, he would call out, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear," implying that as he told this parable in Luke's account, he stressed more than once the need to pay attention. Listen with a sincere heart and look beyond the surface for true meaning. Guys, are you really listening? Guys, pay attention. Listen to what I'm saying. Okay, let's go ahead and keep reading in Matthew 13, verse 18 through 23. And it reads, "Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is what was sown along the path. As for what was sown on rocky ground, This is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet he has no root in himself, but endures for a while, and when tribulation and persecution arises on account of the word, immediately he falls away. As for what was sown among thorns, this is the one who hears the word. But the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. And for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it. He indeed bears fruit and yields, in one case 100-fold, in another 60, in another 30. Okay, let's stop there. Do you remember last week we read that Jesus was objective in his teaching, meaning there was a main lesson. So let's go ahead and look at what that main lesson is. Who is the sower? See, in its immediate context, in other words, in the passage that Jesus is saying, it represents him, the great teacher. Nicodemus called Jesus a teacher sent from God in John 3 and verse 2. But in principle, it could apply to anyone who sows the seed of the kingdom. So now looking at this parable, what do the seeds represent? Well, in verse 19, Jesus said that they represent the word of the kingdom, the gospel, the word of God, as we find in Luke chapter 8 and verse 11, which contains life. Peter in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 23 says that we were born, if you're a Christian, you were born again of an imperishable seed, living or through the living and abiding word of God. The seed is seen to be a seed that can produce riches, but it's dependent on the soil into which it's sown. The gospel is powerful to produce salvation, Romans chapter 1 and verse 16, but not everyone who hears it is going to be saved. Think about, let's say, King Agrippa. Remember in Acts chapter 26, he heard the gospel from Paul, he believed, but he wasn't convicted enough to obey. Thus, the seed of the gospel couldn't grow in the soil of his heart. So before diving into the specifics of each soil, in general, what do the soils represent? They represent the various sorts of attitudes and the hearts that men have towards the gospel and their response to it. Remember how we said Jesus' audience is a mixed group. These are the various listeners, the hearts of these listeners that Jesus was speaking to. Let's go ahead and dive into what each soil represents. What does the wayside soil represent? Jesus explains this in verse 19. The hardness represents the disposition to not believe. They don't understand because they refuse to understand. And he'll talk about that in verse 19. They're not interested in the gospel. They're hard-hearted. And Jesus would compare them in Matthew 13 and verse 14 to the rebellious people in the days of Isaiah, who allowed for their hearts to grow dull, or as the language there implies, thick and hard. I know it's easy to, when we hear the word understand in Matthew 13:19 about them not understanding the word, we think this is a reference to somebody who just, for some reason, doesn't get it. They want to get it, but they don't. But that's not what Jesus is describing here. That's not what Jesus is talking about. It wasn't their inability to comprehend it as it was their desire to not comprehend it. The term understand in this context means they refuse to see it any other way and don't want to look further. They're surface level thinkers and don't want to know anymore. Okay, like for example, if someone is a stubborn person, we'll call them difficult, but sometimes we say, that person's not a very understanding person. Think about this for a moment. What kind of soil was the Ethiopian eunuch? Remember in Acts chapter 8, he's sitting in the chariot reading Isaiah 53, right? He's reading the prophet. And in verse 30, Philip asks him, do you understand what you're reading? The eunuch in verse 31 says, how can I unless someone guides me? In other words, no, I don't, but I want to. And they study together. The eunuch is baptized and he goes on his way rejoicing. Just because the eunuch doesn't understand at first doesn't mean he's like the wayside soil. The usage of understanding is different in this passage. The eunuch didn't get it at first, but his heart was willing to learn. That's good soil. Remember, the wayside soil is not soft. Seed can't penetrate it. It's hard on the surface, hard beneath the surface, through and through. This is not how the Ethiopian eunuch was, or another honest searcher who needs help. That's how the Pharisees were. What may be some possible reasons for hardness of heart? Maybe it's pride. Maybe it's prejudice, fear of giving up lifestyle. Now, who do the birds represent? Who do they represent there in verse 19? Satan, who comes immediately and snatches the seed away. That's how Jesus describes it in verse 19. So now, what does the soil with the rock layer beneath represent? Well, in verse 20 through 21, we learn that this isn't the stubborn, rebellious heart, but the mind which lacks earnestness. Depth is the problem. Some people are easily excited, but they're not willing to see things through. This is the emotional, superficial, impulsive hearer. But they don't actually count the cost like Jesus says one has to do to follow him in Luke 14, verse 28. They're those who impulsively respond. And those who impulsively respond without assessing what they're actually doing, they're prone to fall quickly. Cody and I both could tell you how many times at church camp we'd see kids get baptized, like 10 kids in a week. And there are some who have remained faithful. And then there are some of them that once camp was done, they went back to their normal lifestyle as if nothing happened. Some of them saw their friends doing it. They saw their friends getting baptized. They got swept up in it, but they didn't count the cost. Like the way the sun destroys the plant, tribulation, persecution, hardships destroy that shallow-rooted person. But it can make strong the deeply rooted. Isn't that what James teaches in James 1, verse 2 through 4? So we've seen the application of the wayside soil. We've seen the application of the rocky soil. But what does the thorny soil represent? Okay, we look in verse 22 that the soil in and of itself is good, but unfortunately, it's crowded. These are people with divided loyalties. Jesus would say in Matthew 6:24 that you can't serve two masters, but these people attempt to do that. They desire to follow Jesus, but they still have a foot in the world. And they attempt to try to juggle both. What are some things that he explains that could prevent, that Jesus explains that could prevent a person like this from fully committing? Well, in verse 22, he says that it's the cares of the world. In other words, the day-to-day worries about living can distract us. Jesus would say in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 25, he says, "Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you're going to eat, what you will drink, nor about your body, what you're going to put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing?" Something else that could prevent a person from fully committing is the deceitfulness of riches, materialism. See, riches, they don't deliver what they promise. Solomon would even say in Ecclesiastes chapter 5 and verse 10, he says, "He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income." This also, he says, is vanity or meaningless. The preoccupation with wealth leads to other problems as well. You remember Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 9 through 10 says, "But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils." It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. So what are some things that we could allow to take precedent over Christ? We think about money, we think about things like that, but there are good things as well, like money, as well as family, educational pursuits, desire for popularity. Okay, let's go ahead and move further. Let's look at the final soil. What does the good soil represent? Well, it represents the honest and good heart, these who have wholeheartedly devoted themselves to the message. See, that heart understands and it hears and accepts. Mark chapter 4 and verse 20, it hears and holds fast. Luke 8 and verse 15, it yields fruit. They hear the word, they want more. The more they get, the more they grow, the more they thrive. I think of Psalm 1, verse 1 through 3. That says, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful or the scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He's like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaves does not wither. And all that he does, he prospers." So, this is what Jesus is explaining. Now that we've looked at the main point of this parable, there are other lessons that we can draw from this parable. That may not be the main point, but things that we can learn. For example, for one, regardless of the soil, notice the sower still casts the seeds everywhere, that there was soil. Christ wants everyone exposed to the gospel. Secondly, instead of just focusing on ourselves as sowers, we must also be the right kind of soil. Time and time again, I've read this parable and have taught it, but how many times have I reflected and have you reflected on what kind of soil you are? See, it's easy to leave this parable and leave thinking, well, I'm the good soil, when I may not be. You could be good soil upon your conversion and then become bad soil down the road. There are many Christians who won't accept the truth when it's confronted to them. But you see, that also reminds us of something else. Just because someone is good soil or is not good soil right now doesn't mean they won't ever be. There are some people that are stubborn. Even Jesus' brothers, you remember when he was alive, they didn't believe who he was at first, but then we see them gathered with the rest of the disciples after Jesus ascended into heaven. See, Jesus could easily say what kind of soil a person is, or could easily know what kind of person is, because Jesus could see right through the hearts of men. I'm not even a fraction of perceptive that Jesus was. So I've got to realize that someone may appear to be one way, but they're going to surprise you later on. Finally, what else we learn in this is that there is no salvation and growth apart from the life-giving words of Christ. Now we're going to go ahead and stop there in this parable. Man, this is an awesome parable, and there's so much more that we can dive into in this parable, but this is really the core of what we're going to be talking about, or rather the core of what Jesus is talking about in this parable. Now, I want to say that, like right now, you may be watching this video. So my encouragement is that you watch it again, that you watch this video maybe once or twice through again. What we're going to be doing on Wednesday night, we're going to be gathering on Zoom. I was going to say gathering together like we're going to be physically together, but no, we're going to be on, we're going to do a Zoom conference, and we're going to talk about the parable. We're going to talk about things that we've learned. It's not going to be anything that's mentioned there is stuff that or rather the stuff that we're going to be talking about there, we talked about in this video. So, if you watch the video a few times, you'll be able to jump in the conversation. And if you know anybody that hasn't watched the video, I'm assuming that if you're hearing me say this right now, you're watching the video. But if you know anybody that hasn't watched the video yet, invite them to join our Zoom conversation regardless, because there's still things that we're going to be learning, as well as it's a good time to just fellowship with one another. I want to say thank you guys for supporting these videos, for sharing them, for viewing them. They're fun to make. They're not always easy to make. Sometimes, sometimes I'm having a bad hair day or different things like that, and got to make sure my beard is trimmed. But aside from those things, they're fun to make, and I enjoy the fact that there's teachings on our YouTube channel that we can go back to and watch again and watch again. So I want to thank you all for supporting that. Keep us in prayer. Keep my family in prayer. Me, Kelsey, the baby. I'm finishing up school this week, so please, finishing up school before I register for classes again. So please keep me in prayer this week. And if there's anything I could be keeping you in prayer, let me know. Let me know. Text me. Give me a call. Let me know what you need, and we'll do the best we can as God's family to help you. Love you guys. God bless, and I pray that everyone has an awesome rest of the week.